Hey, what's up, everybody?
And welcome back to Mile Higher Podcast, episode 296. I am your host, Kendall.
And I'm your host, Josh.
And we are joined by our producer, Janelle. Hey, everyone.
Today, we're diving into the case of Lollie Winans and Julie Williams. They were murdered in the Shenandoah National Park in 1996, and this case is still unsolved to this day. It's been a little while since we've covered a case that's taken place in a national park, but the national park missing persons cases and murder cases are some of the most crazy, in my opinion, because if there's any place for somebody to commit a heinous crime, like what happened to Lollie and Julie, the national parks are the place to do it for a number of different reasons. It's crazy to me that a place that is frequented by so many people every single year doesn't have seemingly the security required to protect the amount of visitors that go in and out of these parks, or surveillance.
Would be a huge challenge, though. I mean, they're huge.
Yeah, huge expanses of land. And also the budgets, the federal budgets for the national parks continues to get slashed. And obviously there's a lot more involved with those. The animals, the forest and things like that all need money as well. But it was interesting. I was doing a little research, and as we've talked about in other episodes before, especially like the missing 411 stuff, David Polite has done a bunch of research into missing persons cases in national park systems, and the fact that the National Park Service doesn't even keep track, a log of the amount of people that go missing, and even the amount of people that are victims of crime within national parks. There's some data out there. And on average, it actually looks like 15 people are murdered in our national parks every single year. It goes up or down depending on the year, but on average, there's 15 murders, and many of these cases are unsolved.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest reasons why these cases go unsolved is the jurisdictional issues inside of the national parks, because it's federal land. So local, state law enforcement don't have jurisdiction there, and it falls under the National Park Service, which, as we've talked about in the past, they do have their own investigative branch and they have their own special agents. But for the amount of sheer landmass that is comprised within these parks and the number of people there, it is a small number of basically security, police agents, whatever you want to call it, that exists to investigate these cases. So oftentimes they have to get the FBI involved, but there's a good possibility that the people you need to look at are the ones outside of the park, just outside of the park. And so there's a lot of issues between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement figuring out who's investigating these cases. And we'll see that a lot today with the unsolved murders of Lollie and Julie.
Yeah, I think killers definitely take advantage of that setup. And then the fact, as well, that people are out there and they want to be as secluded as possible from others and have this experience with nature. And so oftentimes there are no witnesses, there's no one around, people don't know that something has happened for days. And so all those factors contribute to the rate of unsolved cases in these national parks.
And yeah, not only that, but it's also out in the wild. It's in the wilderness. Crime scenes are often destroyed in a matter of hours or days, depending on the weather. I mean, there's animals, there's all sorts of other factors that make investigating these types of crimes far more difficult. And so this case is one in particular that definitely needs some renewed coverage on. And
they're still looking for tips and hoping to solve it, although it's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a long time. But there was a book that was written by Catherine Miles, a journalist who's actually a professor of Lollie's back in the day, who wrote a book called Trailed, and she went into tons and tons of detail and got access to a lot of different documents that we didn't get access to, obviously, for research on this episode. But if you want like a real in-depth deep dive kind of down all the different rabbit holes and a more expansive look at some of the suspects, it's a great book. It's on Audible as well.
Nice.
We'll link it below, but we're going to try to, this is a vast investigation that has expanded, been over a number of years. And so we tried to, get all of the components that we could to kind of put it in a concise timeline for you. But a very interesting and a very sad and honestly disturbing case at the same time. So it is a very brutal what happened to Lollie and Julie.
Yeah, especially in such a beautiful place. I mean, the Shenandoah National Park looks
Stunning.
Yeah.
The Appalachian Mountains.
And sometimes I feel bad even discussing that these types of things can happen because I don't want to scare people out there and stop them or like make them afraid to go out and camp and explore these beautiful parks. But I do think it's important to bring these things up because the more prepared you can be, if you're going to be out there, the better, right? It's just, I know
it's good to know that what's actually going on and what has happened in these places so that you're better prepared or just aware of your surroundings. And I mean, in this case, I don't really, based on the evidence, I don't know really what they could have done because whoever killed them did it in the middle of the night, it seems.
Yeah, possibly.
But it just kind of brings that whole fear of, not only being out in the wilderness and there's a lot of, crazy, you go on TikTok and there's all these wild stories of, beasts and things that lurk in the woods. And, but really the biggest predator is other human beings. And so, yeah, a very sad case, but a very important one at that. So,
yeah, I definitely am glad that we're doing this episode and talking about these two. They were both incredible young women, and it's just very, very sad to think about the way that their lives were stolen from them and that there's been no justice for their loved ones to this day.
And some definite missteps by the government and law enforcement for sure. So let's start by digging into the background of Lollie Winans.
So Laura Salisbury, or Lollie Winans, was born on March 9th, 1970. She was the daughter of a wealthy family from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is a very wealthy suburb in Metro Detroit. Grosse Pointe is incredibly affluent, and they have a lot of historical architecture and modern suburban amenities. And though she grew up comfortably, Lollie really rejected her family's wealthy suburban lifestyle and often sort of resented her origins. She seemed to be really open with her friends about her dislike for her hometown. She was definitely a free-spirited person and described as exceptionally down to earth, and she definitely was from everything we've gathered. And many never guessed that Lollie came from such affluent beginnings because she was so chill and so down to earth. Her friends said that she didn't meld well with the stuffy surroundings of her hometown, and after graduating high school, she set her eyes on getting away. Now, Lollie was a brilliant young woman and very socially conscious. She cared deeply about the environment and was very in touch with nature, and these natural affinities led her to apply to Sterling College in Craftsbury, Vermont, where she hoped to become a wilderness guide. Lollie had no issue being accepted and quickly transitioned from life in Michigan to life in Vermont. Very different. And the college really matched Lollie's personality well. Sterling College really focuses heavily on experiential learning and created community focused on social justice, food sustainability, and ecological thinking. Many classes and events allowed students to go outdoors, sounds amazing, and connect with nature. And Lollie really loved that about Sterling. However, things in Vermont didn't actually go well for long. You see, Lollie had dealt with a lot of childhood trauma while away from home. According to her friends and family, she had been sexually abused as a child by a trusted adult, which is how it normally goes. And unfortunately, it didn't seem like Lollie was given the appropriate means to really heal from that mental trauma that it all caused her. So as she began life in Vermont, this, new life, Lollie had fallen into a depression and struggled with her drinking. Eventually, she did drop out of Sterling, and the next few years were filled with poor decisions and a lot of stress. Lollie met and married a man. She also took in a teenage sex offender into her home and, like we said, struggled with alcohol. She thought that showing kindness to this teen would help her kind of overcome her own trauma, but that wasn't the case. And eventually, Lollie did recognize that she needed therapy and got her life back on track. She moved 6 hours east to Maine and began attending college at Unity College, which is another liberal arts college that's focused on the environment. And there she once again trained to become a wilderness guide, which was clearly her passion and goal in life. And she really wanted to run retreats where she could help women like her heal from sexual and violent trauma. She volunteered at a rape crisis hotline and organized hikes for women who were survivors of sexual assault. And she interned with Woods Women, which is really cool. It's a Minnesota nonprofit organization focused on education and adventure. They held courses and events where women could learn outdoor safety and hobbies from other women. And the organization was started in 1977. And by the time it closed doors in 1999, it hosted 59 domestic and 11 international nature trips for women. While she was an intern, she assisted on canoe trips. And on one of these trips, she met the love of her life, Julie Williams.
Born on September 11th, 1971, Julie Williams, and we'll refer to her as Julie, that was what she went by, was the second oldest of Tom and Patsy Williams' daughters. Julie grew up in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where she excelled in academics and sports such as basketball and in tennis. In 1989, she even became a Minnesota State doubles champion. Julie attended Cathedral High School until her graduation in 1990, after which she attended Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. At Carleton College, Julie began focusing on social justice issues. She took great pride in her activism and utilized her bright personality and intelligence to help educate and uplift those around her. Some of her college friends even referred to her as one-person Peace Corps. In 1994, Julie graduated cum laude with a degree in geology. Still, she often went to campus to volunteer and attend activities that aided ecological and social change. One of her professors, Mary Savina, described Julie as, quote, a catalyst for change, and said whenever Julie had choices, she chose a path that valued people, which that's saying a lot coming from other people, An intense passion for helping others and natural empathy are just two of the things that Julie and Lollie had in common. Julie also had a passion for the outdoors and wanted to maintain the environment. This love led her to a women's canoeing excursion through Woods Women, where she met Lollie Winans. The canoeing trip took place in the summer of 1995, and by a complete coincidence, Lollie and Julie shared a tent during the excursion along with a third woman. During the day, they worked together as they traversed the water in their canoe, and by the evening, the two women hit it off as they talked about their shared interests and discussed details about their lives. Lollie knew the two had chemistry, but being open about that was new to both women. While Lollie's realization that she was attracted to women seemed to come quickly, Julie struggled with the idea. Before she met Lollie, she had already questioned her sexuality, but felt that the concept of being lesbian didn't mesh with her strict religious upbringing. After college, Julie moved to Richmond, Vermont, and organized a church group with local women to discuss her questions about herself and her religion safely. When she met Lollie, Julie had reconciled her issues and was ready to begin her relationship with her new partner. That was the first serious lesbian relationship for the both of them. They quickly fell deep in love. With the motivation she found from Julie, Lollie returned to Unity College and finished her final semester with a 4.0 GPA. As the two returned to their lives, they tried to visit each other as often as possible. Every few weeks, one of the women traveled to visit the other, where they would relax together or head out on a fun excursion. While Lollie had been open to her friends about their relationship, Julie was a little slower coming out. This isn't very surprising, although the public reception around the LGBT community was slowly improving and colleges were becoming more inclusive. The reality is the 80s and 90s were an incredibly dangerous time for openly queer individuals. It seemed that Julie didn't feel entirely safe to express her sexuality publicly, which didn't seem to bother Lollie, who had always been an incredibly understanding person. Besides, neither of the women had told their parents about their relationship. This episode is brought to you by one of my favorite snacks, Chomps. If you're somebody who gets hungry throughout the day, but you don't want to reach for that unhealthy snack, you want some protein that tastes delicious, then Chomps meat sticks are where it's at. I absolutely love Chomps. I've been eating Chomps for years, and it is my go-to snack whenever I get hungry. I love all of the different flavors that they have, from beef to venison to turkey. They've got you covered in all types of different flavors. My favorite is the jalapeno beef stick. That is absolutely delicious, and the snack I go to every single time I feel a little hungry in my tummy. What I love about them is that the ingredients are top notch. I've tried all the meat sticks out there on the market, and Chomps is by far the most delicious and the best for you. With 0 sugar, up to 12 grams of protein, and low carb, it has so many great chompable flavors in every bite. Chomps are simply made with natural ingredients you can feel good about. They're filled with the highest quality, sustainably sourced meat without any fillers, so you can feel good about what you're snacking on. In years past, I would buy the cheap meat sticks, and I would just feel utterly terrible after I'd eat them. My breath would stink, and I just would feel terrible. Chomp Sticks comes in 10 delicious bold flavors, so there's a healthy snack option for everyone. Or you can grab a variety pack and try a little of everything. I love to throw them in my car. You can take them hiking, camping, wherever you want to go. At the office, you can just have them in your desk, and they are an amazing and delicious snack, and kids love them too. With thousands of 5-star reviews, snackers around the world have satisfied their hunger cravings with Chomps, including myself. And even better, you can order online and have them delivered straight to your door. You can even subscribe for ongoing savings. Right now, Chomps is offering our listeners 20% off your first order and free shipping when you go to chomps.com/milehire. Go to chomps.com/milehire to see all the delicious flavors and get 20% off your first order and free shipping. That's chomps.com/milehire. Don't forget to use your link to let them know we sent you.
So by early 1996, the two of them were really getting into the groove of their relationship. They had decided to move in together and found a home in Huntington, Vermont. And the two of them even shared a golden retriever who is adorable. His name was Taj. And they finally felt like they had created this perfect little family and life together. Julie had even landed her dream job in the state. She had received a grant to conduct hydrology research on Lake Champlain. And she was supposed to begin her research that summer. And the two of them had celebrated Julie's new career in May by visiting Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And the two of them set up a rough camp in the backcountry, but the location wasn't quite as rough as it sounds. While they camped in a much more secluded location, they were only 250 yards away from the famous Skyline Drive, which is a stunning road that passes through the park. The camp was near a creek and a short walk from Skyline Lodge, which is a resting point for those exploring the park's trails. And Julie and Lollie were seen hiking with Taj on May 24th, and they were in high spirits and seemed to be enjoying the trip. A few days later, Taj was spotted wandering the trails alone, so not a good sign. And when Julie's family hadn't heard from her by May 31st, they reported the two of them missing. It was very challenging for Tom Williams, who is Julie's dad, to really, grasp the situation because he had just seen his daughter in April. Julie and her sister had spent time with him to celebrate Easter down in Florida. And Tom remembered how great the trip had been and how sad he was when his daughters flew back to Vermont. But still, he knew he would, make time to see her again soon and had hoped to hear about Julie's amazing new job. However, he knew that something had to be wrong when the women did not return from their camping trip because there was just no way that they chose to simply not come home. So at that point, Tom alerted the authorities and park rangers quickly began searching for the two of them and found their car parked just north of Skyland Lodge. Rangers were hopeful that the women had simply decided to extend their stay, but took the search seriously nonetheless. It isn't uncommon for campers to become lost or injured in state parks, of course, and rangers had no way to determine how skilled the women were when it came to being outdoors. However, their friends and family knew that Julie and Lollie really could navigate tough forested areas, and they were trying to hold out hope.
But on the evening of May 31st, after an extensive search of the trails and corridors near the Skyland Lodge, the park rangers had found something concerning. Deputy Chief Park Ranger Bridget Bonnet updated the family that evening that while they hadn't found Julie or Lollie, they had found Taj unleashed and wandering alone in the park. But before I continue, I want to show you a quick clip from when all this happened of a park ranger explaining how Julie and Lollie's permits helped investigators narrow the search.
And while officials say this is an isolated incident, hikers now aren't taking any chances, filling out their backcountry permits. It was this clue that led rangers to the victims.
And the permit then gave us an idea of about when they would be in the park and their approximate location. So that is one reason that they were found so quickly.
So obviously, as you just heard, they were doing some searching. The permits actually helped them figure out the general area that they were in. And also the area that they searched in was where Taj was found, their dog. And on the evening of June 1st, 1996, the park rangers went down a popular horse trail called Bridle Trail, I believe, near the Skyland Lodge, and that's when they found Julie and Lollie's campsite. The camp was in a terrible state. There was trash and clothing strewn about. Their bright yellow tent was partially collapsed. At the time, the park regulated that backcountry campers avoid camping near major trails where they would disrupt the scenery for passing tourists. Julie and Lollie were very aware of these rules and constructed their camp so that it was not visible from the passing trails, which this may explain why nobody found the horrifying sight before the park rangers over the busy Memorial weekend. There inside the partially collapsed tent was Lollie's body wrapped in her sleeping bag, bound and gagged with duct tape. A few feet away in the trees was Julie's body wrapped in her sleeping bag. Both had been brutalized and there was apparent trauma to their bodies. They were bound with tape and both of their throats had been slashed. Immediately, the area was cordoned off and an intense investigation into the crime was launched. This is also when the special agents of the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch started working the case, which if you're not familiar with it, we've mentioned it in other episodes, but it's basically the police force for the National Park Service. However, the public was unaware of the incident 36 hours after the discovery. It's thought that this was the time it took for the FBI to get called in and arrive on scene, but regardless of the reason, people in the area were very upset by the decision not to tell the public, because in their minds, and rightfully so, a killer could still be on the loose in Shenandoah, and nobody cared about protecting others in the area from suffering from a similar fate. Here's a group of campers being interviewed amidst the investigation.
Early morning in the Shenandoah National Park. Ethan Winter and Jeannie Seipel are still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes when they learn about the murders.
Oh, that doesn't happen in national parks at all, really, does it? I mean, it's extraordinary.
It isn't known if the decision to wait was made because the National Park Service agents were waiting for the FBI to arrive, but the FBI was indeed required to take over the case. Though park rangers and, the National Park Service police are highly trained in navigating the park and investigating crimes that occur in the park, national parks fall under federal jurisdiction, so, local police sometimes assist, state police sometimes assist these cases, but again, it's the primary responsibility of federal authorities to investigate these cases. While the Rangers and the National Park Service Police were utilizing the investigation along with state police, the federal government made all the significant decisions. The FBI collected all the evidence, but quickly pointed out that there was little remaining evidence at the scene to pinpoint a culprit. And the other fact was that the women weren't from the area and didn't seem to have enemies, meaning that the attack appeared random, which always makes it more difficult to investigate. There were some clues left behind at the scene. The duct tape found on the women had hair stuck inside that didn't belong to either victim. A glove that didn't belong to the women was also found at the crime scene. Inside, investigators found hair that matched the hair on the duct tape. Another piece of evidence found at the crime scene helped investigators put together a loose timeline of events, a camera the women had been using to document their trip. And unfortunately, we don't have any of the photos to show you from that. It's all still classified, but I assume there's probably some things in there that at least helped establish, what their trip had been like as far as the timeline goes.
So here's the timeline that the FBI was able to put together based on those photos and also from what details they were able to gather from witnesses in the area. So on May 19th, Julie and Lollie arrived at Shenandoah. They went into the woods and set up their camp. They didn't emerge from their camp for a couple of days. And then around May 21st, a storm forced the women to leave their camp and hitch a ride with a park ranger to a lodge. There, they renewed their camping permit and waited out the rain before they returned to set up a new camp. Based on the photos in the camera, the women climbed Hawksbill Mountain and made their final camp near a stream off the Appalachian Trail. Then the two of them were last seen hiking on the 24th of May, and within 48 hours of that sighting, it's believed they were brutally murdered at their campsite. After identifying their bodies, investigators determined that Julie was found 30 feet away from their tent, and she was actually found still wrapped in her sleeping bag, which gave investigators the impression that maybe she had been dragged out of her tent while she was sleeping. And it's really upsetting, but both women were gagged and their hands were wrapped in duct tape. But what's really strange is DNA evidence suggested that the tape on Lollie's wrists had first been placed over Julie's mouth. However, it's unclear to everyone, as far as I know, why the killer chose to repurpose the tape. And I've been trying to kind of think about this, and I couldn't come up with any reason as to why they would have done that.
Well, I think what this indicates is that this attack was very, very fast. Yeah. And I think everything happened so quickly that the killer was obviously worried about them making noise. And so I think the priority was to get tape over the mouth. And perhaps they
just out of tape, or
either ran out of tape or couldn't rip off new tape, so they just tried to repurpose the tape. Because it's also interesting that Lollie's ankles were bound with a pair of long thermal underwear, while Julie's ankles had been bound with duct tape.
And sources have offered other conflicting information on Julie's and Lollie's time of death as well. Some sources say that the women were killed on the evening of the 24th of May, and others say that the two of them had been deceased for 48 to 72 hours before discovery. Almost right off the bat, when news first broke about their murders, a lot of speculation started around the case naturally, because whenever there's unknown information, people want to try to fill in the blanks. And one of the big things that people wondered about was why their dog Taj was left unharmed. It seemed unlikely that this random attacker would choose a couple that is in the company of a large dog, and that has led many people to think that whoever killed the two of them may have met them previously and befriended the dog and seemed comfortable with them, which that to me doesn't really make sense anyway, because it doesn't matter if you had befriended the dog before. If you start attacking their owner, the dog is going to probably react. But we have to keep in mind that this is a golden retriever.
Yeah, the nicest dogs.
Yeah, this isn't a guard dog. And it's very possible that the killer just released the dog or scared the dog off, and Taj just ran away in fear.
But others began to speculate that the women were victims of a hate crime. The women weren't out to many people in their lives, but journalists began to speculate about them. The media asked Julie and Lollie's friends about their sexuality, but most remained tight-lipped out of respect for the deceased, as you should. However, one journalist contacted a friend of Julie's, Reverend Rebecca Strader. Rebecca informed the journalist that the pair were a romantic couple, which many found distasteful. Rebecca defended herself and clarified that she hadn't outed the women out of spite or malice. Instead, she wanted to ensure that the gay community was aware of the crime and wanted to help keep them safe, as the murder could have been a hate crime. With this realization, investigators did have to consider the possibility, but still there is no way to know if the women were targeted for their sexuality based on the crime scene alone. The reality is that somebody could have stalked the women, someone could have spotted them and found it a good opportunity for violence, or they could have straight up targeted them because of their sexuality. But without an interview with the culprit or a living witness, there is no way to know. Others who learned about the murder of Julie and Lollie instantly drew connections to the Colonial Parkway murders, which the Colonial Parkway murders were a set of serial murders that took place between 1986 and 1989. And as the name implies, these killings took place along the Colonial Parkway, which is a 22-mile long road that cuts through the Colonial National Historical Park in Virginia. The park is approximately 145 miles from where Julie and Lollie were killed. At the time of Julie and Lollie's murder, there were 8 known deaths at the hands of the Colonial Parkway murderer. The victims were found in pairs, as the MO of the killer was to find a couple sitting in their car on the parkway and murder them. The causes of death in these murders included strangulation, stabbing, and gunshots, and in each of the cases there was no evidence of burglary or sexual assault. It is important to note that this string of killings and all speculated associated murders after 1989 are only connected circumstantially. Though the FBI stated in 2024 that they were able to connect 2 of the original deaths to a man named Alan Wilmar Sr., who died in 2017, the rest of the associated murders have never officially been linked to Alan. At the time of Julie and Lollie's death, the FBI did not believe their deaths were related to the Colonial Parkway killer, as their murders deviated too significantly from the killer's typical MO of finding couples in cars stopped along the Colonial Parkway. However, others couldn't help but consider one of the couples murdered on the Colonial Parkway, Rebecca Dowski, who was 21, and Kathy Thomas, who was 27. The women were in a relationship, and they were found in a vehicle that appeared to have veered off the road into dense shrubs. The officer who found the vehicle discovered the women's dead bodies inside. The women were found with rope burns on their necks and wrists and had signs of strangulation. Both women had their throats slashed so much that they were nearly decapitated. Though the women in the vehicle were doused in diesel fuel, the murderer had not attempted to set them on fire. There was also no evidence of sexual assault on the women, and there appeared to be nothing missing from the vehicle. They found jewelry, money, and both women's purses inside the vehicle. But despite the speculation, there was no evidence to connect the crimes.
So for the first year following their murders, tips were rolling in like crazy. And investigators said they worked through thousands of them, but they all led to no new leads, unfortunately. And with a lack of physical evidence and witnesses, investigators really had little to go on to find the women's killer. A reward of $25,000 was offered for any information that could lead to a conviction in the case, but still, investigators were no closer to actually finding a suspect. The reward did bring in more tips, however, but investigators were really far from the truth. However, a little over a year after Julie and Lollie were brutally slain, It seemed plausible that the suspect was in reach. In July of 1997, a really scary incident occurred at the Shenandoah National Park. A Canadian tourist named Yvonne Malbasha was riding bikes with friends along Shenandoah's Skyline Drive, and she became separated from her group, but wasn't lost. And while she admired the Blue Ridge views and sought out her party, a man driving a truck suddenly forced her off the road. Yvonne told police that the man screamed profanities at her, exited his vehicle, clearly enraged, and he tried to force her inside of his vehicle. But she threw a water bottle at him and ran into the tree line, using her bike and a tree to help block the man from getting to her. The man continued to scream sexually explicit profanities at her before returning to his truck and attempting to run over her numerous times. Eventually, this guy sped away from the scene, and Yvonne quickly reported the crime to a nearby park ranger. And the man, luckily, was stopped before leaving the park and identified as Daryl David Rice. Inside his vehicle, investigators discovered hand and leg restraints. Now, Daryl was a single man in his late 20s with no kids and no previous criminal record. He was from Charlottesville, Virginia, and had recently been fired from his job for creating a hostile work environment. Just listen to what this guy would do. According to his former coworkers, he was known to yell sexual profanities at them, so definitely falls in line with what Yvonne was saying. He would punch walls in the bathroom, and he would do this so hard that he would actually leave holes. He would steal his coworkers' lunches, intentionally run into people so that they would spill their drinks, and was even caught tearing a female coworker's photo from the wall and then throwing it in the trash. It was determined pretty clearly that Daryl had an extreme contempt for women, and he was quickly arrested and charged with the attempted abduction of Yvonne Malbasha. The trial began in 1998, and Daryl pled guilty to attempted abduction. He was sentenced to 135 months in a Virginia federal prison. Now, during Daryl's interviews in 1997, he said some strange things that led the FBI to think that maybe he was involved in the deaths of Julie and Lollie. Daryl made statements to the police about hating women and wanting to ruin their days. FBI investigators took a second look at the 1996 video footage recorded of the park entrance at Front Royal, and they found Daryl Rice had entered the park at 8:05 p.m. on May 25th, 1996. He also entered the park at the Rockfish Fap at 4:57 p.m. on May 26, 1996, and he wasn't seen returning to his vehicle until June 1st. So investigators questioned Daryl, but he claimed that he was never in the park on May 25th and 26th, though he did admit being in the park with his friends on June 1st. And during their interview with Daryl, investigators in Julie and Lollie's murders asked the man if he had ever heard of their case, and he told them that he had only heard that the women were lesbians. But when asked about what he thought the killer may have thought during the crime, he said, quote, "He could be thinking the same thing I'm thinking about, like people at work, ... nagging on me, thinking about that."
So hate.
Yeah, possibly, but we'll explain more. His friends and family don't think that he was hateful towards
Yeah, but
LGBT
that's
people.
disputed.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
Allegedly, he was saying hateful, homophobic things to the police as well.
Mm-hmm.
After authorities interviewed the man and looked into the crime that landed him in prison, in 2001, investigators charged Daryl Rice with the murders of Lollie and Julie. Authorities stated that this was a hate crime, as they cited a 1994 ruling. It was the first time federal prosecutors had utilized that ruling to enhance a murder charge. However, Daryl's family and friends were shocked. According to his family and friends, Daryl had multiple openly gay friends who said he never had an issue with their relationships. Daryl's sisters went on to state that they had never known him to have open hatred for women. He could become enraged, but never based on others' genders or sexuality. But on top of this, the only evidence prosecutors had that linked this to a hate crime was a short 1-minute long phone call Daryl had made to an LGBTQ support group in California. Daryl's lawyers claim that this call was a mistake and that he had just been trying to call the Grateful Dead hotline and somehow just misdialed and called this support group instead, which I don't know about that. Janelle, you were enlightening me earlier on what the Grateful Dead hotline was, but for those that don't know what that was.
Yeah, so I wasn't really familiar with it because obviously they don't have this anymore, not the internet is a thing, but back in the day, people could call this number to get info on like upcoming tour dates and just like announcements having to do with the dead. So you'd like call and be like, "Hi, thanks for calling the hotline. They have an upcoming show at, the Oakland Coliseum on May 6th, 7th, and 8th, whatever. Your ticket's on sale this time, whatever." So it was just a place that people could call in to get more info and where they could get tickets. And I mean, obviously, the Grateful Dead has a giant following, so I'm not surprised that something like this was invented for them.
Anyways, back to the case. But the case kept moving forward. Yvonne Malbasha, Daryl's 1997 victim, said that he targeted her for being a woman. So that directly contradicts what his family says, and I think you can kind of see what's going on here. But apparently he had yelled at Yvonne to show him her breasts and attempted to force her into his vehicle when she refused. At Daryl's trial, Yvonne said, quote, "He told me he was going to get me and to get into the truck, and he was screaming at me. I was terrified. I thought he was going to kill me." Daryl even told investigators not only that he targeted Yvonne because she was a woman, but that women are vulnerable and easier to subdue. However, he also told investigators that he felt his crime toward Yvonne was a result of his frustration with people at his previous job. He also told them that he felt like he was starting to come undone in the summer of 1995, which aligns with the timeline of him beginning to act erratically at work. It also means that he was already in a state of being unhinged at the time Julie and Lollie were murdered. With this information, FBI investigators were convinced that Daryl Rice was the man they were looking for. However, others who followed the case were concerned that investigators had tunnel vision and were refusing to consider other possibilities in the pair's death, which is sadly what happened here. They really felt like this was their guy and this is what we're going to roll with, no matter if it works or not. In 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced that the federal authorities were charging Daryl with the crime and sought the death penalty. They said their case was incredibly strong and knew Daryl was their man. But sadly, the case quickly began to fall apart because the only foreign DNA found at the crime scene was the hairs found in the glove and duct tape. However, hair analysis isn't equal to true DNA testing. Hairs can rarely connect a specific person to a case. However, they can be used to exclude suspects. What investigators knew is that the hair found at the scene had to come from the killer. It was found in the duct tape used to bind and gag the victims and in the gloves allegedly worn by the killer, but nowhere else at the scene of the crime. After they tested the hair, experts explicitly excluded Daryl Rice as the culprit. So despite the investigators' confidence in all the charges that they brought against Daryl, they were all dropped in 2004, and this sent the investigators back to investigating the case with no conclusive evidence and zero leads. The case ran cold for years and additional speculation began to arise. I did want to mention one thing about Daryl Rice's case, because this is very, very important to note. So obviously the DNA evidence doesn't work out, but what they did is they used a not very well-known legal concept called without prejudice. And these are used in cases where prosecutors are convinced of the guilt of the defendant. They feel like they do have a strong case that could persuade a jury or judge, but because of some sort of procedural error that occurred during the trial, they feel like they can't get the conviction that they need to get. And by dismissing a case in this way, the federal government basically reserves the right to bring the case back against a person at any time. And in the case of Daryl Rice, they were on the eve of jury selection for his trial. And at any point, the federal government can go and basically get right back to the spot that they left off on and continue the trial against him. So Daryl actually lives in the state of double jeopardy, which is how and why the Virginia Innocence Project actually became involved in the case, because they had actually seen this as a miscarriage of justice against an innocent person, which is all very interesting to note. So there is a possibility that if they're able to find another way to connect him conclusively to this crime, that Daryl could be right back on trial for this.
That same month that Julie and Lollie were murdered, another body was found in a field off of Route 29 in Virginia, and that body belonged to 25-year-old Alicia Showalter Reynolds, a grad student at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Now, Alicia had been missing since March of 1996, when she left Baltimore to shop with her mother in Charlottesville, Virginia. And when she didn't arrive, her family knew that something was wrong. In July, Alicia's body was found, and she had been murdered, although the cause of death has not been publicly released, so we're not exactly sure what happened there. But when police found her vehicle abandoned miles from her body, they noted a white napkin underneath the wiper. Now, this is a common sign of car trouble like some type of signal to get another driver to pull over and help or let a passerby know that the vehicle had been left due to being inoperable. However, the car was actually in perfect working order. The police in that case speculated that maybe the killer used the same trick to get Alicia to stop on the side of the road. With that detail released, dozens of additional women came forward to tell police that they had nearly fallen for that same tactic. A man described as being 6 foot tall with blonde hair had pretended to have car trouble to get the women to offer him a ride in their vehicles. And most women said they didn't give the man a ride, but a few did. However, luckily nothing happened to them. And a week before Alicia disappeared, the man seemed to be escalating. A woman contacted police about an assault that she had fallen victim to on Route 29. A man matching the description that the other women had given offered her a ride home when he saw her walking on the side of the road. He seemed friendly, so she accepted. However, he made the woman feel very uncomfortable as he pulled to the side of the road and claimed he couldn't see oncoming vehicles. She became uneasy and attempted to leave the vehicle, which angered this guy, and they fought as he drove, and eventually he pushed her out of the car, and she actually broke her ankle. 7 days later, Alicia disappeared in the same area. The police began referring to this man as the Route 29 stalker. And when the theory of a connection with the Route 29 stalker arose, FBI investigators tried to claim that Daryl Rice could actually be the Route 29 stalker and could be responsible for Alicia Showalter's death as well as Julie and Lollie's. However, this theory was not accepted by many people following the case. Even Alicia's mother made a statement that she did not believe Daryl Rice was involved in the death of her daughter. Many pointed out that in 1997, a year after Alicia, Julie, and Lollie were killed, Daryl was incapable of successfully abducting a woman who had nothing but a bike and a water bottle to protect her. And as I'm sure many of you know, in cases of serial killers, they often get better at what they're doing the longer they're doing it. And if Daryl was the killer in the first 3 cases, why would he have gotten worse at abducting and killing as time went on? I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So regardless, there was no evidence that tied Daryl to the Route 29 stalker case and no way to connect the Route 29 stalker with Julie or Lollie. And for decades, the case has remained cold. In 2021, the FBI put out a new call for info on Lollie and Julie's deaths. This time, they focused on informing the audience beyond the boundaries of the state of Virginia. They said, quote, "The beauty of Virginia's parks and trails are enticing to people, not just from Virginia, but other states. And during these outdoor adventures, people come across other hikers and visitors, some who make a memorable impression. Over the past 25 years, we are aware that those who were hiking in the park at the time of those murders, who were visiting local establishments, and even resided in the area may not be local to Virginia any longer. Therefore, it is crucial that this case continues to be shared throughout the country. It is possible there are people anywhere from Virginia to the West Coast that could have information valuable to the case." And that's part of the reason why we wanted to cover this case today, too, is obviously we have a not only national but international audience. And they are still, like we said, looking for tips and information. But this call for information actually angered many in the case, including Julie and Lollie's friends and family. And not because they don't want to find their killers, but because many of them claim that they know exactly who killed Julie and Lollie, and that is Richard Evanitz.
Which you may know of the name Richard Evanitz. The man was a serial killer, kidnapper, and rapist who was responsible for the deaths of at least 3 teenagers in Virginia. The man also abducted and sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl named Kara Robinson. Kara is the only known survivor of Richard. She shared her courageous story with others and was often interviewed about her experience. Kara was kept in an apartment Richard shared with his mother and wife, but the two were on a trip to Florida at the time of Kara's abduction. The night after Kara's abduction, as Richard slept, Kara became free from her restraints and fled, leading police to the apartment where she had been held. However, Richard was already gone when they got there. Upon entering the apartment, police found evidence linking Richard to the murders of Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk, and Katie Lisk. Sophia, who was 16, had been kidnapped from her family's doorstep on September 9, 1996. She was sadly found 5 weeks later, deceased in a swamp. Kristen Lisk, who was 15, and Katie Lisk, who was 12, were sisters who disappeared from their yard on May 1, 1997. They were found dead a few days later in a nearby river. After Kara's escape, Richard fled toward Florida. On the way there, he called his sister and told her he had, quote, committed more crimes than he could count. His sister promptly reported his location to the police, who stopped him on the way to Florida. However, before he could be arrested, he shot and killed himself. Over the years, police have thought that Richard could be connected to a large number of similar murders in the area. As many people point out, Richard said he committed more crimes than he could count, yet they only knew of 3 victims. Kara's abduction and discovery of Richard's crimes happened in the summer of 2002. When his information was released, people instantly drew parallels to both the murder of Alicia Showalter and the murders of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. However, all these years later, the FBI refused to pursue that route. The family and lawyers of Darrell Rice have asked what harm it would do to test the evidence and hairs against Richard, but it appears the FBI has refused to conduct the testing. Darrell's lawyer even pointed out at the time of Julie and Lollie's murder that Richard had been missing for 2 days and his family had no idea where he had gone. Friends of Richard said he would make remarks about how he appreciated Ted Bundy because he knew how to commit his crimes in different jurisdictions to avoid detection by police. And some of Richard's previous wives said that he had been open about having fantasies of being with 2 women. Maybe the most damning of all, Richard had once told his wife, to whom he was married to when he died, that she should avoid going to the Shenandoah National Park because there are dangerous people out there. She also told police that he still often visited the park himself. Despite this, the investigators refused to consider that Richard may be involved. So one of the big reasons that Lollie and Julie's parents really feel like Richard is the guy that committed these crimes is all thanks to the work that was done by Catherine Miles in her book Trailed. She really dug into this and actually made a lot of the connections that really kind of pushed investigators to start looking at Richard. In her research, Catherine was able to determine that over a 14-month period in the late 1990s, that Julie and Lollie were just 2 of 8 women and girls killed in a specific location of central Virginia. And based on the victims and the heinous nature of his crimes, that's really how she kind of started figuring out, like, this guy was operating in this area. He's likely connected to a lot of these other unsolved murders. And so it seems, based on all the evidence and things that's even come out of his mouth, that Richard is the most likely perpetrator here. It's obviously unfortunate from an investigation standpoint that he is no longer alive and we may never know, but I just wanted to give her some kudos because she was really the one that pointed investigators in the direction of Richard.
Now, it has been 28 years since Lollie and Julie were brutally killed on what should have been one of the best camping trips of their lives. And there is no explanation to give the family peace and no new leads despite the renewed call for tips in 2021. Julie's father, Tom, gave this interview in 2021 on how he's dealt with his daughter's death and her unsolved case. Let's take a listen.
Doesn't get any easier after 25 years.
No.
Tom Williams still thinks about his murdered 24-year-old daughter, Julie, every day. Still thinks about the last time he saw her, Easter, 1996.
So that was April, and within 60 days, she was dead.
So brutal. I don't know how you couldn't, go a day without thinking about her.
Yeah,
just
and
like, how do you ever go on?
And knowing that this is such a solvable case too, and that it's gone so long without justice being served, and likely the person who did the murders is now deceased, but to not have been able to get that closure has just got to be terrible to deal with every single day.
Well, the hope is now that with the advancements in DNA testing, that maybe this case actually could be solved, and at least they would get that,
know
closure.
Exactly what happened.
Justice is is off the table at this point, which really sucks.
If it was Richard, I mean, there's still a chance that it wasn't
That's
Richard.
true.
We don't know for sure. It just
That's
seems
true.
based on
Seems
circumstances that,
yeah.
and this really does seem like the work of a serial killer, based on the crime scene. But again, you never know.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But many people are worried that we may never truly know what happened to Julie and Lollie, which is just absolutely heartbreaking to think about. In September of 2003, the Central Minnesota Community Foundation started the Julianne Williams Fund. And according to their website, quote, the Julianne Williams Fund was established to honor the life of Julianne Marie Williams, who died in 1996 at the age of 24. Julie loved the outdoors and was in the process of tying together her love of nature and geology and her concern for people's lives as she was establishing her career. The purpose of the Julianne Williams Fund is to reflect on the essence of Julie, who she was and what she valued. It is to promote through outdoor activities the building of self-esteem, safety, confidence, and the empowerment of girls and young women. The fund is also committed to supporting youth activities that enhance mutual respect between all people and promote the enjoyment of active lives. This clip from right after her murder shows how respected she was in wildlife and remembered as someone who loved the outdoors.
Williams, one of 4 children, was a geology major who graduated from college magna cum laude 2 years ago. Family and friends remember her and what she loved to do.
She always is hiking, always camping. She was extremely proficient at it. She had taken many people up into the Boundary Waters, had taken numerous classes, first aid classes. Was an expert at that. I would have gone with her at any time.
The fund also provides a grant to women who want to follow in Julie's footsteps through the study and appreciation of the outdoors, and provides between $1,000 and $8,000 to those who qualified. And based on a 2023 tax filing, the fund has awarded over $17 million in Julie's name since 2003, which is really, really cool. Julie's family celebrated her 25th birthday at Shenandoah only a few months after her tragic death. Her father, Tom, told reporters that he often reflects on the last memories that he had with his daughter. He remembered how happy Julie was when she visited him on Easter and how excited she had been to start, this new job she had coming up, and just how overall at peace she really seemed. Lollie is remembered fondly by her friends. One friend wrote a beautiful tribute piece to Lollie in 2023. She wrote that when she visited her old school campus in 2019, she suddenly felt a rush of memories of her time there with Lollie. She met Lollie in 1988 and said that she remembers her beautiful, full cheeks, her dimples when she smiled, and her sweetness radiated around her like an aura. She remembered her laugh and the reflection from her glasses as she stood in the light. One story she told of Lollie was from their senior year of high school and helps to shed light on the sort of fun and carefree person that Lollie really was. She said, living away from home at 14 causes you to grow up pretty quickly. We loved each other fiercely, fought like siblings, held grudges, hurt each other's feelings. We were envious when friendships shifted and cared deeply for one another. We took photos of each other, not with iPhones, but with actual 35 millimeter cameras, and I cherish these photos. I just love that. She also said, senior year, we had 2 singing groups in our class. I love this. The Ragged Robins were the girls that could actually sing, and their voices were crisp, clear, and angelic. There was a motley crew of us that continued the tradition of participating in singing, performing with the Shredded Tweets, and we were awesome. She goes on to say, among our best numbers were Greased Lightning and She Shook Me All Night Long. We dressed up, prepared sets, and sang in front of our peers in the theater. I close my eyes and see Lollie in our Grease performance. She loved Phil Collins and the drums, and she would air drum throughout the day and around campus. I still blast the drum solo from In the Air Tonight in my car every time I hear it, even 30 years later, as a salute to Lollie. So really beautiful. And even though so much time has passed, there is still hope that this case could be solved. And of course, if you or anyone you know has information that could lead to a break in the case of Lollie Winans and Julie Williams, please call the FBI tip line at 1-800-225-5324.
Yeah, this is still a very active and open investigation with the FBI and National Park Service. So there is hope that I'm hoping that the DNA, it sounds like the DNA testing is likely going to happen, but you never know with DNA from years past that it's going to yield anything. But I think there is hope with technology that eventually we will figure out whose hair it was at the scene. So that hopefully, the families can get some semblance of closure with this, at least knowing who did this. But I mean, there's no happy ending or really positive outlook with this one.
Of course not. But I do think it would make such a huge difference for them to have some of those answers. It's the not knowing, forever wondering, the idea of living their whole lives without knowing what actually happened or who was responsible for stealing their lives.
Yeah. And I think you might be feeling like, is it safe to, go to the national parks? And, I know a lot of people and a lot of females that go hiking by themselves even.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously going with somebody else or a group of people is always preferred. But
Definitely.
if you look at the number of deaths that happen in national parks, I mean, the number of murders is a very, very small
Mm-hmm.
percentage. But it does happen. And there are sexual assaults that happen in national parks as well. And so that's always something that you got to, I guess, keep in the back of your mind that, these things do happen and they are rare, but it's definitely something to think about and know about. So
Yeah. Just be vigilant, and prepared.
yeah, I'm curious because it's interesting that the crime statistics within the national park system isn't tracked better. Like the databases are all outdated and old, and there should be an official place you can go to look up the statistics, but there definitely is crime that happens just like there is anywhere.
I'm reading this one thing that came out in 2024, I think in February, saying approximately 243 people die annually on National Park Service lands. Considering the crowds the parks receive, that's not that many, with nearly 312 million visits in 2022. It works out to a death rate of less than 1 in a million. So kind of like you were saying, Josh, obviously it's possible and people need to, proceed with caution, just like with any kind of activity like that. But I think that, it shouldn't deter people from still going out and exploring those parks.
Yeah. And I think the way that we can help this problem, and something that the National Parks Conservation Association says is the best approach to combating crime in the parks is to properly fund the Park Service.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate reality is the Park Service continues to get their budgets cut for other reasons, like funding the military and other things that get the wide range of the federal budget. We've talked about that in the past. It's probably been a little while since we've dived into the federal budget and where all of our money goes. And so they just don't, they're doing the best that they can oftentimes, and they just don't have the resources or manpower to, adequately ensure safety in these vast expanses of wilderness. And I mean, it'd be pretty much impossible to guarantee safety out in the middle of the wild. But, had they had more resources, more trained individuals, maybe they would have solved this from the jump and this wouldn't be an unsolved case. So, I think it's perhaps gotten better as time's gone on since 96. I know when we covered Harold Hinthorn,
Oh, yeah.
they actually did a really good job at figuring that one out.
Mm-hmm.
The National Park Service agents did, and the FBI. So I think it's gotten better since 96, but it doesn't change what happened then. So just definitely something to keep in mind. And, we hope that, one day we'll get answers to this case. But yeah, we want to know your thoughts on it for sure.
Yeah, definitely let us know what theory makes most sense to you.
Yeah, I think all signs point towards Richard. I think
I
the
agree.
timing, the fact he was operating in that area, similar victims,
Yeah.
sexually motivated,
Mm-hmm.
just a really, really bad dude.
But it's totally possible it's someone that's not even on anyone's radar.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up too, because I covered a case recently on Lights Out, the David Shearing case. This was a national park in Canada, and a whole family was executed
God.
just camping. And they looked far and wide for the killer, and it turned out the killer was just outside of the property, lived
Wow.
mile or two, give or take, from the site of the murders.
How
And
long did it take them to?
they never went and asked the neighbors. They never went around and asked anybody in the direct vicinity of the park if they knew anything. And as soon as what's crazy, as soon as they did, they're like, "Oh yeah, there's this guy, David Shearing. He's a weirdo. He's said this or that. He's your guy," basically. Like the locals knew.
All it would have took is doing the
Right.
due diligence to talk to neighbors.
And I think sometimes what happens is, because of the jurisdictional issues, is that because you have to collaborate with local, the federal can't just go outside of the park and then start, going around to neighbors, knocking on doors necessarily, because they don't have the jurisdiction. And that's where local law enforcement comes into play. But with this, I do wonder if anybody was ever talked to locally, if there's any locals that live just on the outside of these entrances to where the park is, if they would know of anybody that could have possibly been involved. And I think that's the difficult part of it, is the jurisdictional aspects make it difficult to investigate it and get that collaboration that you need to thoroughly investigate inside and outside of the park. Because sometimes the perpetrator is just right around the corner and you don't even know it.
Yep.
Which is crazy to think about, but
it's oftentimes the case, honestly.
Yeah. But yeah, let us know who you think is, if you think it was Richard or you think it's somebody else that hasn't been named yet. Yeah, our hearts go out to Julie and Lollie's family, of course. And just, I mean, this is very, very difficult to deal with.
These two seemed like such incredible women.
Absolutely. But we'll go ahead and leave it there today. And thanks again for joining us for another episode of Mile Higher. And we'll see you next time.